So let's begin our discussion on macromolecules or biological molecules or biomolecules, just three terms for really the same thing. And so hopefully you're not too hungry as you watch this video, but if you think about a pizza or a burger or a salad or anything else that you eat, we already know something about biological molecules because we think about the carbohydrates that are in our foods, the fats that are in our foods, the proteins that are in our foods, and all three of those are types of biological molecules. And when we eat our food, it goes through the digestive system, and our digestive system breaks down those larger molecules into smaller molecules, and we absorb those. Then our cells can turn those into other biological molecules that our bodies and cells need in order to accomplish everything that our cells are doing. So in this discussion, we'll talk more about these four biological molecules or macromolecules. So carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. Now, we started talking about the food that we eat, and I mentioned carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids or fats because that's something that we think about regularly. Maybe we're counting calories, or we're worried about a high protein, low carb diet, or something like this, where we're interested in the amount of these molecules in our food. All four of these are actually present in the food we eat, including nucleic acids, because if we are consuming food that was ever alive, anything alive, right, has nucleic acid. However, as far as calories or an energy source, the carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids are all that are actually providing energy source to our cells. Now, before we talk about any of these categories, one thing we need to talk about first is carbon. And carbon is found in the periodic table. It is an element, and we could say that we are carbon-based life forms. So in other words, the majority of our bodies and cells are carbon-based or are made up of carbon. Now, when we use the term organic in science, we don't mean that food was grown in a specific way without certain pesticides. What we mean is it's a molecule that contains both carbon and hydrogen. So the molecule that you see over here is actually the simplest organic molecule. So it has one atom of carbon and 4 atoms of hydrogen, and it's methane gas. Carbon, as I mentioned, is the basic foundation element. So the majority of the molecules in our cells are going to be made up of carbon. So those categories that we mentioned, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids, are all carbon-based. They're made up of carbon with some other atoms, which we'll talk more about the specifics of those structures. But at this point, what we need to know is they're definitely carbon-based. Now, why is carbon so important? Why does it make such a why is it the building block for our cells? Well, if you think back to when we talked about protons and electrons and bonding, it has 4 electrons in its valence shell, which means essentially we would say if you were thinking about putting molecules together, that it can make 4 bonds. So as you see here, each of the 4 bonds of carbon is bonding to another atom of hydrogen. Now these are covalent bonds. They're very strong bonds. Which is important in these molecules, and it can bond to many other things besides hydrogen. It can bond to additional atoms of carbon, and it can also bond to things called functional groups, which we'll talk about in just a minute. The other interesting thing about carbon is it can form chains, okay, so just many carbons bonded together. It can form rings. It can bond with other atoms, as we mentioned, like oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. So it's a very versatile, if you're thinking about, building blocks, carbon is a very versatile molecule to build off of. Now, these are functional groups that you will find commonly in many biological molecules. It's important that you start associating what these functional groups are with the name and recognize them as we begin to look at different types of molecules. So the first of these is called a hydroxyl group, and this right here, 1 oxygen and 1 hydrogen, is what a hydroxyl group is. So this R that's represented here just means some other part of the molecule, right? It could be any other type of structure, and as long as it has this OH, that's the hydroxyl part that we're speaking of. Okay, A methyl group is this CH3. So we just saw methane, which was carbon with 4 hydrogens. So in this case, the carbon, right, is bonded to 3 hydrogens. And then this part where it has the R means anything else, right? So that would be the methyl group. A carbonyl group that we see here is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen. So remember, the R can mean anything else that's going on here, but the carbonyl part means carbon double bonded to oxygen. Now, a carboxyl group is a carbon double bonded to oxygen with another, so this OH here would be a hydroxyl, right? But the whole thing is a carboxyl group. And so we're going to see this a little later on today when we talk about amino acids. And speaking of amino acids, the other functional group we'll see with amino acids is this here. We have a nitrogen with hydrogen atoms. So the carboxyl and the amino group are going to be very important when we get to proteins and amino acids. The final group, the phosphate group, has a phosphorus atom in the middle with 4 oxygens bonded to that phosphorus, and you'll notice that one of the oxygens has a double bond to the phosphorus and the other 2 are actually hydroxyl groups. Now, the great thing about macromolecules or biological molecules is there is some common themes that we can understand to help us with all 4 classes: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. And notice I have a picture down here of some Legos, individual Lego blocks, and then a completed project. So what I want you to think of is, if you're thinking about Legos, each individual block, right, would be a building block. And you can take those blocks and you can put them together in different ways to form a product or a polymer. So what I want you to think of as a polymer, poly meaning many, so many of those individual building blocks or monomers put together. And for all of these classes of biological molecules, they're going to have a type of monomer or the building block that they're made of. And then for the polymer, for the larger macromolecule, it's going to be produced because many of these smaller monomers or building blocks are bonded together to form the larger polymer. So if you look at the figure up here, okay, we have a couple of different types of reactions that I want us to look at. And these are going to be general for any of those classes of molecules. So we have a general monomer here, or building block, and another monomer here. And if the cell is trying to build up a larger molecule or a larger polymer, then it needs to make a bond between those two, right? So notice that they're separate on this side of the equation. But over here, what we have done, this reaction has created a bond, right? It's linked those 2 monomers together, so it's building up the polymer. This is called a dehydration reaction or dehydration synthesis, and the reason is dehydrate, right, means to lose water. And you'll notice that this right here, an O and 2 H's, really will make a molecule of water, and you see we have a molecule of water that's leaving, right, or being released as the new bond is made. So that's why it's called a dehydration reaction, because a molecule of water is actually lost. Down here in the hydrolysis reaction, the opposite is true. So we have monomers bonded together, and in order for the cell to break that bond, right, or to release them as individual monomers, a molecule of water is needed, and now we see that that is put back in between where the bond for those existed. So what I want you to see is, depending on the needs within the cell can have reactions that build up monomers into polymers or break polymers down. For example, in the food we eat, what's happening in your digestive system, these large polymers like starch or proteins are being broken down into their individual monomers so that your cells can absorb those. Now, remember, hydrolysis is when they're broken down, and dehydration reaction is when they are actually being built up. So even though these are general, we will look at how these apply to each of the individual categories: carbs, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Now, I just wanted to show you some general structures of each of these categories. So what we see here is an example of a protein. It's a very large molecule. This happens to be myoglobin, which is important in carrying oxygen that you need. The monomer for a protein, for any protein, is an amino acid. In other words, proteins are just made up of many of these individual amino acids bonded together. There are 20 different amino acids, or 20 different types of those building blocks. Okay, polysaccharides, okay, which these are carbohydrates, okay, are another category. The monomer for these is called a monosaccharide. Mono mean one, saccharide meaning sugar. So essentially we're talking about a single sugar. And here's a list of a few important sugars. The most common that we hear about is probably glucose and fructose. Those would be the monomers. Down here you see some important polymers, right, or polysaccharides. So starch is one of those. And every single one of these little rings that you see here is really an individual monomer or monosaccharide. Okay, glycogen is another example of a polymer or polysaccharide, as well as cellulose and amylose. So we'll talk about those in more detail when we go through carbohydrates, but I wanted you to see generally. Okay, what about lipids? So a fat is a type of lipid, and a fat is also called a triglyceride. So when you have your blood checked and they give you your level of triglycerides, this is the molecule that they're talking about, okay? The monomer for a triglyceride is one molecule of glycerol with 3 fatty acids. That's where the tri comes in, because there's tri means 3 fatty acids. So this right here, all in blue, is the glycerol. And here's one long fatty acid, another fatty acid, and a third fatty acid. So again, we'll look at those in detail as we look at fats. The final category is nucleic acid. And DNA is one type of nucleic acid. The other type would be RNA. And we're showing here the double-stranded DNA alpha helix. And this alpha helix is made up of individual monomers, so the building block of nucleic acid is called a nucleotide. And there are 4 types of those. And again, we'll look at the details of those when we get into that. Now, this is a chart that I just think is important to sort of keep everything straight about the 4 classes: carbs, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids, what the monomer is for each of those, some examples of what those monomers are, then the polymer, and finally some examples of those polymers. So this is something that we'll refer to often as we go through the individual categories.